This does feel like it's coming out of nowhere, and it's because when the port contracts were signed by the Hong Kong-based Hutchinson ports, those ports were expected to be controlled by British law, which was sort of governing Hong Kong for many decades. But since 2020, China has really assumed control of Hong Kong, and so Hutchinson ports basically became Chinese after getting the Panama Canal port contracts. And so the level of concern did ramp up quite recently, and not for insane reasons.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 312th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today, before I do anything else, I would like to offer my most heartfelt congratulations to my research and production assistant, Claire, and her husband, who just welcomed a healthy and adorable baby boy into their family. And I'd also like to congratulate our executive producer, Barbara, who is now a grandma. I think I can safely speak on behalf of the entire Congressional Dish community when I say that we are so happy for all of you. And just a quick production note, the show notes, which provide all of the sources that we use to create every episode, will still be provided for every episode, but if they're a bit messy for the next few months, that's because I'm creating them myself, and I have never done as beautiful a job with them as Claire has. I miss you terribly already, Claire, but please enjoy your maternity leave. And the show notes will be there for you to fix for me when you get back. Okay, so now let's get into the episode. Because President Trump has, for months, been threatening to take back the Panama Canal, most recently on March 4th during his not a State of the Union in front of Congress.
My administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal, and we've already started doing it.
And I know every time I've heard him talk about the Panama Canal, I've been like, is this some nutty Trump thing, or is there something to this? And when he says, we're already doing something about it, like, what does that even mean? Well, the good news is I got some answers from a hearing that took place in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on January 28th. And so by the end of this episode, after listening to a lot of that testimony, I can say with confidence that you will understand why they are focusing on the Panama Canal right now. Because Trump's focus on this, as random and out of nowhere as it seems, is not as nutty as it seems. But before we get into it, Congressional Dish actually has more to offer you. Because for people who pay for this show on Patreon, I am now doing weekly episodes called Last Week in Congress. And so please support the show to have access to those episodes that will keep you more up to date while I'm doing these deep dives for the public. Or if you're not interested in those episodes, please support the show because we provide you all of these episodes without ads, which makes you my customer instead of companies, and which saves your time. Because I know I'm sick of listening to hour-long podcasts, which are actually 40 minutes after their 4 5-minute long ad breaks. Those ad breaks are selling your time for often tens of thousands of dollars. And that's the kind of money I'm leaving on the table to keep this show ad-free and free of corporate influence. And so please pay for the show if you consider your own time valuable. But also today, I'm also going to ask you to please share Congressional Dish. I don't market this show because, quite frankly, I'm a terrible businesswoman. There's all kinds of things that I could do that would divert my time away from producing episodes and make me more famous and make me more money. But creating these episodes, that's what I spend the vast majority of my work hours doing. And I think most people want me to keep doing that because producing episodes is how I best serve my existing producers and audience. It's how I best serve you, especially in crazy times like these where there is so much to look into. And so that's what I do. And so, could you please be my marketing team? Could you share clips or links to episodes on your social media? Or could you badger your friend who you know would dig this podcast and try and get them to start listening to it? And if there is another podcast that accepts guests that you think should have me on as a guest, could you please reach out to them? And thank you to Travis Chappell, who hosts Travis Makes Money, and Scott Jones, who hosts Give and Take, for having me on this last week. And I'll put links to both of those episodes for you in the show notes. But I can promise you that the vast majority of my guest appearances on other shows have happened because that podcaster's audience requested me as a guest. And I can tell you that me reaching out to other podcasters, which I have, has worked 0% of the time. And so while I'm still physically in Austin, Texas, which I'm going to be until the middle of April, if there are any Austin-based podcasters you think might want to talk about Congress in these crazy times, please reach out to them and tell them about Congressional Dish. And I'll also be in Los Angeles this summer if there's anyone you'd like me to talk to there. And thank you in advance for any of the marketing work that you can put in for the Congressional Dish team. We really, really, really appreciate your efforts. Because without you, there are no efforts. Okay, so now that you know how to help the show, let's jump into the Panama Canal. Now, to get us started, I think it's important to understand why the Panama Canal even matters. So here's Joseph Kramek. He is the president and CEO of the World Shipping Council. Basically, this guy was a former Coast Guard officer for 28 years who moved into the private sector and became one of the top lobbyists for the international shipping industry. And he was so good at being their lobbyist that they promoted him to be the president and CEO of the International Shipping Industry's Lobbying Organization, or trade organization, as they call them in corporate world. And since big business is what our foreign policy is really all about, here's what the shipping industry says about the Panama Canal.
As you have heard, using the Panama Canal to transit between the Atlantic and Pacific saves significant time and money. A typical voyage from Asia to the U.S. or East Coast can be made in under 30 days using the canal, while the same journey can take up to 40 days if carriers must take alternate routes. From a commercial trade perspective, the big picture is this. One of the world's busiest trade lanes is the Trans-Pacific. The Trans-Pacific is cargo coming from and going to Asia via the United States. Focusing in a bit, cargo coming from Asia and bound for U.S. Gulf and East Coast ports always transits the Panama Canal. Similarly, cargo being exported from U.S. and East Coast ports, a large share of which are U.S. agricultural exports like soybeans, corn, cotton, livestock, and dairy, also almost always transits the Panama Canal. The result is that 75% of canal traffic originates in or is bound for the United States.
So basically, we use that canal more than anyone. And it turns out that makes sense because we built it. Here's Chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
But between the American construction of the Panama Canal, the French effort to build an isthmus canal, and America's triumphant completion of that canal, the major infrastructure projects across Panama cost more than 35,000 lives. For the final decade of work on the Panama Canal, the United States spent nearly $400 million, equivalent to more than $15 billion today. The Panama Canal proved a truly invaluable asset, sparing both cargo ships and warships the long journey around South America. When President Carter gave it away to Panama, Americans were puzzled, confused, and many outraged. With the passage of time, many have lost sight of the canal's importance, both to national security and to the U.S. economy.
Now, I don't know the accuracy of Senator Cruz's framing of President Carter's decision to, as he put it, give away the Panama Canal, because that happened before I was born, and quite frankly, I don't trust Ted Cruz. But it doesn't really matter. What matters right now is who controls the Panama Canal. And so to teach us about the current ownership and management of the canal, here's Louis Sola. He is the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, which is the federal agency that since 1961 has been responsible for policing United States international ocean transportation.
The Panama Canal is managed by the Panama Canal Authority, ACP, an independent agency of the Panamanian government. The ACP is a model of public infrastructure management, and its independence has been key to ensure a safe and reliable transit of vessels critical to the U.S. and global commerce. In contrast, the broader maritime sector in Panama, including the nation's ports, water rights, and the world's largest ship registry, falls under the direct purview of the Panamanian government. Although the ACP operates independently under U.S. law, both the ACP and the government of Panama's maritime sector are considered one and the same. This means that any challenges in Panama's maritime sector, including corruption, lack of transparency, or foreign influence, can have a direct or indirect impact on the operations and long-term stability of the canal. This legal perspective highlights the need for vigilance in monitoring both the ACP's management and Panama government's policies affecting maritime operations.
Okay then. So that's the official management structure for the canal right now. And so what's the problem? Well, boiling it down quite succinctly was Chairman Ted Cruz of Texas.
President Trump has highlighted two key issues. Number one, the danger of China exploiting or blocking passage through the canal. And number two, the exorbitant costs for transit.
And Senator Cruz got more specific about the first concern, which is China exploiting or blocking the canal.
Chinese companies are right now building a bridge across the canal at a slow pace so as to take nearly a decade. And Chinese companies control container ports at either end. The partially completed bridge gives China the ability to block the canal without warning. And the ports give China ready observation posts to time that action. This situation, I believe, poses acute risks to U.S. national security.
And Luis Sola, who again is the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, he testified that the concern is broader than just a bridge and some ports. And I don't think long-term listeners of this show will be all that surprised to hear the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative mentioned in this upcoming testimony. But if you're new here, the Belt and Road Initiative is basically how the Chinese government is competing with the global economic system that we set up after World War II, which I nicknamed the World Trade System. In the World Trade System, the International Monetary Fund was for many decades the only loan shark in the world. It would, and still does, go to countries that need money, loan them lots of money, but then demand changes to their economic laws in return. And those changes would often include demands for privatization of their resources, as in demands that the multinational corporations that our government has long served be allowed to take those resources, pay the locals as little or nothing for them, and then use those resources and sell them for profit. Profits that would then be divided amongst shareholders, aka the most wealthy people in the world. Well, China took the IMF playbook and straight up ripped it off. And so starting in 2013, China's Belt and Road Initiative has been investing in massive infrastructure projects around the world, but specifically in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative has built many thousands of miles of high-speed rail lines and roads and bridges, lots of transportation infrastructure projects that connect developing areas to the rest of the world, but specifically to China. But unlike the International Monetary Fund, the Chinese generally haven't attached strings to these projects that required changes to the country's economic laws. Instead, what the Chinese loan sharks seem to want are strategic influence over other governments, more markets for Chinese products, and money in the form of interest on those loans, since most Chinese banks are not privatized, which means the Chinese government collects the interest payments. And so with that in mind, here's what the Federal Maritime Commission chairman told Congress about China's relationship with Panama.
Since 2015, Chinese companies have increased their presence and influence throughout Panama. Panama became a member of the Belt and Roads Initiative and ended its diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Chinese companies have been able to pursue billions of dollars in development contracts in Panama, many of which were projects directly on or adjacent to the Panama Canal. Many were no-bid contracts, labor laws were waived, and the Panamanian people are still waiting to see how they've been benefited. It is all more concerning that many of these companies are state-owned and in some cases even designated as linked to the People's Liberation Army. We must address the significant growing presence and influence of China throughout the Americas and in Panama specifically.
And so here's Senator Ted Cruz's conversation with the Federal Maritime Commission chairman about that bridge that's being built by the Chinese in Panama.
So Panama was the very first Latin American country to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. And right now, China is building a fourth bridge across the Panama Canal for car traffic and light rail. Chairman Solo, why should Chinese construction of a bridge near Panama City concern the United States?
Mr. Chairman, we all saw the tragedy that happened here in the Francis Scott Key Bridge incident and the devastation that had happened to Baltimore. We also saw recently what happened in the Suez Canal, where we had a ship get stuck in there. It's not only the construction of the bridge, but it's a removal of a bridge, as I understand it, called the Bridge of the Americas. It was built in 1961, and that would paralyze cargo traffic in and out of the canal.
And here's our new senator, John Curtis of Utah, who took Mitt Romney's seat when he retired. Well, here's the new guy speaking to the Federal Maritime Commission chairman, Luis Sola.
Is there any reason that China can't watch or do whatever they want from this bridge to see what get the intel from these containers? And does that concern anybody?
Well, it definitely concerns Southern Command because they brought it up on numerous occasions that there could be some sort of surveillance or something like that on the bridges.
And in case you're wondering, here's why Panama contracted with the Chinese for that bridge in the first place. Here's Daniel Maffei. He is a former member of the House of Representatives who then became a consultant, helping rich people and corporations make money in the private sector, and who is now currently a commissioner on the Federal Maritime Commission.
While we were down there, both of us heard, I think, several times that the Panamanians would, the ones we talked to anyway, would welcome U.S. companies coming in and doing a lot of this work. Frankly, their bids are not competitive with the Chinese bids. Frankly, they're not that existent because U.S. companies can make more money doing things other places. But even if they were existent, it is difficult to put competitive bids when the Chinese bids are so heavily subsidized by China.
So that's one thing Trump and friends are worried about, a bridge being built over the canal by Chinese companies. And as Senator Cruz said in regards to the Chinese influence over the canal, they are also worried about the Chinese involvement in Panamanian ports. Here's Senator Cruz talking to Luis Sola and Daniel Maffei, both of whom serve on the Federal Maritime Commission.
Panama also recently renewed the concessions for 2 container ports to a Chinese company, Hutchison Ports PPC. Of course, Chinese companies are controlled by the Communist Party. How does China use control of those ports for economic gain?
Mr. Chairman, I am a regulator, a competition regulator, and the Chinese ports that you're referring to, let me put them into scope. The one on the Pacific, the Port of Balboa, is roughly the same size as the Port of Houston. They do about 4 million containers a year. They have about 28 gantry cranes. The one on the Atlantic is the same as my hometown of Miami. They do about 1 million containers. So where Roger Gunther in the Port of Houston generates about $1 billion a year, and Heidi Webb in Miami does about $200 million, the Panama Ports Company paid zero for 20 years on that concession. So it's really hard to compete against zero. So I think that's our concern, our economic concern that we would have.
Commissioner Maffei, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do too also think it is important. I would point out that you don't have to stop at either port. It's not like these 2 ports control the entrance to the canal. That is the Canal Authority that does control that. However, I think it's of concern. I would also point out that the Panamanian government thinks it's of concern too, because they're conducting their own audit of those particular deals. But we remain very interested as well.
So the concern is that the Chinese manage 2 ports, one on each side of the Panama Canal. And those are contracts which the U.S. regulators see as unfair due to the Chinese government subsidies, which make it damn near impossible for private companies to compete. But I did find this bit of history of the business deals that gave the Chinese at least some measure of control over those ports super interesting. Here's Eugene Kontorovich. He is a professor at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University.
I think it's important to note that these port operation companies that operate the ports on both sides, when they received their first contract, It was just a few months before Hong Kong was handed over to China. In other words, they received them as British companies, sort of very oddly, just a few months before the handover. Now, of course, since then, Hong Kong has been incorporated into China, has been placed under a special national security regime, and the independence of those companies has been greatly abridged. To say nothing of state-owned companies involved elsewhere in the Canal area, which raise significantly greater questions.
Which I think explains why we haven't really heard much about the Panama Canal until now. I think this explains why it feels kind of like a weird Trump obsession as opposed to a real concern of people who know things, which it actually seems to be. Because no one in this hearing dismissed the Panama Canal concerns as just some, Trump cray-cray. But this does feel like it's coming out of nowhere, and it's because when the port contracts were signed by the Hong Kong-based Hutchinson ports, those ports were expected to be controlled by British law, which was sort of governing Hong Kong for many decades. But since 2020, China has really assumed control of Hong Kong, and so Hutchinson ports basically became Chinese after getting the Panama Canal port contracts. And so the level of concern did ramp up quite recently, and not for insane reasons. Because this port concern is also a piece of a larger puzzle. Here's a good question from Senator Cruz to Daniel Maffei of the Federal Maritime Commission.
What would China's incentive be to heavily subsidize those bids to undercut American companies and other companies?
Yeah, it's not a real short answer, but Senator, China has made no secret of its ambitious policies to gain influence at ports throughout the globe. It's invested in 129 ports in dozens of countries. It runs a majority of 17 ports. That does not include this Hong Kong company, right? So that's just direct Chinese-owned ports. So it has been a part of their Belt and Road strategy, whatever you want to call it, the Maritime Silk Road for decades. So they believe that this influence, this investment in owning maritime ports is important to their economy.
But now I think it's important to examine what business any of this is of ours. Because aside from the United States companies and our military making up 75% of the port traffic, the fact is that Panama is a sovereign country, and in general, sovereign countries get to decide who they do business with. But it turns out Panama isn't all that sovereign when it comes to the Panama Canal because of the treaty that was signed by President Carter when we gave Panama control of that canal. Here's Professor Kantorovich.
Now, in exchange for the United States ceding control of the canal, which it built and maintained, Panama agreed to a special regime of neutrality. The essential features of this regime of neutrality is that the canal must be open to all nations for transit, that's Article 2, equitable tolls and fees, Article 3, an exclusive Panamanian operation, Article 5, the prohibition of any foreign military presence, Article 5. Article 5 provides that only Panama shall operate the canal. Testifying about the meaning of the treaty at the Senate ratification hearings, the Carter administration emphasized that this prohibits foreign operation of the canal as well as the garrisoning of foreign troops. Now, Article 5 appears to be primarily concerned about control by foreign sovereigns. If Panama signed a treaty with the People's Republic of China, whereby the latter would operate the canal on Panama's behalf, this would be a clear violation. But what if Panama contracted for port operations with a Chinese state firm, or even a private firm influenced or controlled in part by the Chinese government? The Suez Canal Company was itself, before being nationalized, a private firm in which the United Kingdom was only a controlling shareholder. Yet this was understood to represent British control over the canal. In other words, a company need not be owned by the government to be in part controlled by the government. So the real question is the degree of de jure or de facto control over a foreign sovereign company, and scenarios range from government companies in an authoritarian regime, completely controlled, to purely private firms in an open society like the United States, but there's many possible situations in the middle. The treaty is silent on the question of how much control is too much, and as we'll see, this is one of the many questions committed to the judgment and discretion of each party. Now, turning to foreign security forces, the presence of third country troops would manifestly violate Article 5, but this does not mean that anything short of a People's Liberation Army base flying a red flag is permissible. The presence of foreign security forces could violate the regime of neutrality, even if they're not represented in organized and open military formations. Modern warfare has seen belligerent powers seek to evade international legal limitations by disguising their actions in civilian garb. From Russia's notorious little green men to Hamas terrorists hiding in hospitals or disguised as journalists, bad actors seek to exploit the fact that international treaties focus on sovereign actors. Many of China's man-made islands in the South China Sea began as civilian projects before being suddenly militarized. Indeed, this issue was discussed in the Senate ratification hearings over the treaty. Dean Rusk said informal forces would be prohibited under the treaty. Thus, the ostensible civilian character of the Chinese presence around the canal does not in itself mean that it could not represent a violation of the treaty if, for example, these companies and their employees involved Chinese covert agents or other agents of the Chinese security forces. So this leads us to the final question: who determines whether neutrality is being threatened or compromised? Unlike many other treaties that provide for third-party dispute resolution, the neutrality treaty has no such provision. Instead, the treaty makes clear that each party determines for itself the existence of a violation. Article 4 provides that each party is separately authorized to maintain the regime of neutrality, making it a separate obligation of each party. The Senate's understanding accompanying to ratification also make clear that Article 5 allows each party to take, quote, unilateral action. Senator Jacob Javits, at the markup hearing, said that while the word unilateral is abrasive, we can, quote, decide that the regime of neutrality is being threatened and then act with whatever means are necessary to keep the canal neutral unilaterally.
So there was a lot there. But essentially what stands out to me is that the United States, the Trump administration, does have the power to decide what is and what is not a treaty violation. And Professor Kantorovich can be reliably viewed as someone whose opinions would be listened to by Team Trump. He's a Heritage Foundation guy. Heritage Foundation as in the authors of Project 2025. And he's a shameless Zionist. He lives in a West Bank illegal settlement, which explains his infuriating side comment in which he compared the idea that the Chinese could be hiding their military members in the port operations to the idea that Hamas members were hiding in hospitals and disguised as journalists, which he thinks justifies the Israeli military bombing every single hospital in Gaza and the targeted murder of dozens of clearly identified journalists in blue press jackets who dared to show the world just how savagely the Israelis were committing mass murder. Ideologically, Professor Kantorovich is MAGA. His opinion would matter to this White House. And he sees the current situation in the Panama Canal like this.
The presence of Chinese companies, especially Chinese state companies, but not limited to them, do raise serious issues and concerns for the neutrality of the treaty. And I should point out, in relation to some of the earlier questioning, the canal, for purposes of the neutrality treaty, is not limited just to the actual locks of the canal and the transit of the of ships to the canal. According to Annex 1, Paragraph 1 of the treaty, it includes also the entrances of the canal and the territorial sea of Panama adjacent to it. So all of the activities we're talking about are within the neutrality regime, the geographic scope of the neutrality regime in the treaty. Additionally, I should point out that the understandings between President Carter and Panamanian leader Herrera, which were attached to the treaty and form part of the treaty, provide that the United States can, quote, defend the canal against any threat to the regime of neutrality. And I understand that as providing some degree of preemptive authority to intervene. One need not wait until the canal is actually closed by some act of sabotage or aggression, which, as we heard from the testimony, would be devastating to the United States. But there is some incipient ability to address potential violations.
So MAGA professor says the United States has some degree of preemptive authority to intervene. And here's the chair of the Federal Maritime Commission, the Ocean Police.
I believe that the security of the canal has always been understood to be provided by the United States. Panama does not have a military. And I always believe that there's been a close relationship with Southern Command, that we would provide that. And it would be nice to see if that we had a formalization of that in one way or another, because I don't believe that it's in the treaty at all.
And so without a military, Panama really can't stop us from acting. And it doesn't sound like they can stop us legally either. Here's Committee Chairman Ted Cruz speaking to Professor Kontorovich.
If the United States determines that Panama is in violation of the treaty, what is the range of remedies the United States would have for that treaty violation?
So I think it may be shocking to people to hear today, but when one goes over the ratification history and the debates and discussions in this body over this treaty, it was clear that the treaty was understood as giving both sides separately the right to resort to use armed force to enforce the provisions of the treaty. And it's not so surprising when one understands that the United States made an extraordinary concession to Panama by transferring this canal, which the United States built at great expense and maintained and operated, to Panama gratis. And in exchange, it received a kind of limitation, a permanent limitation on Panamanian sovereignty, that Panama agreed that the United States could enforce this regime of neutrality by force. Now, of course, armed force should never be the first recourse for any kind of international dispute and should not be arrived at sort of rashly or before negotiations and other kinds of good offices are exhausted. But it's quite clear that the treaty contemplates that as a remedy for violations.
And in his conversation with the professor and at the end, the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, you can almost hear the war justification propaganda script being written by Republican Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska.
Are the companies now on controlling both sides of the Panama Canal, the Chinese companies, subject to the PRC's national security laws that mandate cooperation with the military, with state intelligence agencies? Does anyone know that? Professor,
they're subject all the time. They're subject to those laws all the time by virtue of being Hong Kong companies. And they face, of course, consequences for not complying with the wishes of the Chinese government. And one of the arguments,
wouldn't that be a violation of the treaty? And isn't that a huge risk to us right now that the Chinese?
So that is a threat to the neutrality.
They invaded Taiwan, invaded the Philippines. They could go to these two companies saying, hey, shut it down, make it hard, sink a ship in the canal. And wouldn't they be obligated to do that under Chinese law if they were ordered to by the PLA or the CCP?
I don't know if they'd be obligated, but certainly the People's Republic of China would have many tools of leverage and pressure on these companies. That's why the treaty specifically says that we can act not just to end actual obstructions to the canal. We don't have to wait until the canal is closed by hostile military action. That would be a suicide pact. That would be catastrophic for us. But rather that we can respond at the inchoate, incipient level to threats. And then this is up to the president to determine whether this is significantly robust to constitute
So, Professor, aren't we kind of walking up to the idea of a suicide pact? Because we got two big Chinese companies on both ends of the Panama Canal who, if there's a war in Indo-PACOM, Taiwan that involves us and China, these companies would be obligated to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party and PLA. I mean, aren't we kind of walking up to a very significant national security threat already?
Yeah, certainly there's a threat, and I think what makes the action of the Chinese government so difficult to respond to, but important to respond to, is that they conceal this in sort of levels of gray, right, without direct control.
Well, let me ask you on that topic, this is my last question, Professor. Let's assume that we find out, and again, it wouldn't be surprising, I think you can almost assume it, that these two companies have Chinese spies or military officials within the ranks of the employees of the companies. Let's assume we found that out. Somehow that becomes public. But I don't think it's a big assumption. It's probably true right now. So you have spies and military personnel within the ranks of these two companies that are controlling both ends of the Panama Canal. For you, Professor and Chairman Sola, wouldn't that be a blatant violation of Article 5 of the Neutrality Treaty, if that were true?
Yeah.
Which probably is true.
Yes.
I
do think that it would be. I do think it would be a clear violation. As Dean Rusk, former Secretary of State Dean Rusk, said at the ratification hearings, informal forces can violate Article 5 as well as formal forces.
And Chairman Sola, do you agree with that? And is there any evidence of Chinese spies or other nefarious Chinese actors embedded in these companies?
Senator, we have no information of that.
Okay.
That's not under the purview of the federal.
But you agree that would be a violation of Article 5 of the Neutrality Treaty?
I do.
So cook up some evidence that there are Chinese spies or military members at those ports, and the pretense for war is fulfilled. I don't think the Republicans are fucking around here. And the federal regulators are not telling them that these ideas are crazy. And so I think the threat of force against Panama is a real one. But perhaps not a necessary one. Here's Senator Deb Fischer of Nebraska speaking to the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission.
In 2021, Hutchinson was awarded those two ports, Port Balboa and Port Cristobal, in a no-bid award process. Can you tell me, does the United States have any authority or recourse with the Panama Canal Authority under our current agreement with Panama to rebid those terminal concession contracts? And perhaps, Mr. Kontorovich, that's more in your purview?
Senator.
Yeah, so,
Senator Fischer, both of those ports were redone for 25 years until 2047, if I believe, and they have to pay $7 million is what the ongoing rate is for the Port of Houston and the Port of Miami size concessions.
And it can't be rebid until after that date?
Well, I believe that's what the Comptroller's Office is auditing, both of those ports and that contract. And that was done under the previous Panamanian administration. A new administration came in and they called for an audit of that contract immediately.
Well, I don't know what's going on with that audit. The contract for now remains intact. But if the contract can't be changed, it appears that the nature of the company that holds the contract can. Because on March 4th, news broke that BlackRock, one of the richest so-called American multinational investment corporations in the world, had agreed to buy a majority stake in Hutchinson Ports, the Hong Kong company that has the Panama Canal Ports contract. And with this takeover of Hutchinson, the United States will get control over other ports as well. Here's Daniel Maffei of the Federal Maritime Commission.
Senator Sullivan was talking about Hutchinson Ports. That's actually the same company that runs terminals on both ends of the canal. I am concerned about that. However, if we want to be concerned about that, all of us should lose a lot more sleep than we're losing. Because if there's spies there, then there might be spies at other Hutchinson ports. And there are other Hutchinson ports in almost every part of the world. They own the largest container port in the United Kingdom, Felixstowe, which is responsible for nearly half of Britain's container trade. They control major maritime terminals in Argentina, Australia, the Bahamas, Germany, Indonesia, Mexico, Myanmar, the Netherlands, South Korea, and Tanzania. If owning and managing adjacent ports means that China somehow has operational control or strategic control over the Panama Canal, they also have it over the Suez, the Singapore Straits, the Mediterranean Sea, and the English Channel.
And so with this BlackRock deal, the Chinese would lose effective control of 43 ports in 23 other countries, which is a pretty big blow to the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. And let's give credit where it's due, even if we dislike the guy. It's a pretty big win for the aggressive diplomacy of the Trump administration. And if it goes through, the deal is expected to be finalized in the middle of this upcoming summer. And so that's some possible good news. And if that deal goes through, it does seem like it will bring down the threat of using military force, although not entirely, because this deal does nothing about that bridge that they were concerned about. And it does nothing about the other bigger picture issue with Panama Canal that Senator Cruz and the Trump administration is concerned about, which are the costs for transit through the Panama Canal. Here's Senator Cruz.
Meanwhile, the high fees for canal transit disproportionately affect Americans because U.S. cargo accounts for nearly 3/4 of canal transits. U.S. Navy vessels pay additional fees that apply only to warships. Canal profits regularly exceed $3 billion. This money comes from both American taxpayers and consumers in the form of higher costs for goods. American tourists aboard cruises, particularly those in the Caribbean Sea, are essentially captive to any fees Panama chooses to levy for canal transits. And they have paid unfair prices for fuel bunkering at terminals in Panama as a result of government-granted monopoly. Panama's government relies on these exploitative fees. Nearly 1/10 of its budget is paid for with canal profit.
But this is important to know as well. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota speaking to Federal Maritime Commissioner Daniel Maffei.
Do you know of any instances where the United States has been singled out or treated unfairly under the neutrality treaty in the operation of the canal?
I do not. I would add that one of the reasons why saying the U.S. is disproportionately affected by raises in canal fees and other kinds of fees at the canal is because the United States disproportionately utilizes the canal.
And so what is making transit through the canal expensive for everyone? Well, it's a few things. Here's Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, Luis Sola, talking to Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee.
The fees that I think we are looking at, or we have been looked at, the reason that we went there was because of the auctioning of the slots. And so what Panama did is they had a smaller percentage, maybe 20% allocation, and then they moved it up to 30% and 40% because it became a moneymaker for them. So as they reduced...
Okay, and let me interject here. The auctioning of the slots gives these the right to skip the queue.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so just for the record there, continue.
So the auctioning of the slot, under maritime law, it's first come, first served. But Panama's always put a certain percentage aside. And they started to put more and more. So we got a lot of complaints. We got a lot of complaints from LNG carriers that paid $4 million to go through. And we got a lot of complaints from agriculture that didn't have the money to pay to go through because their goods were gonna go down. So if you look at the financial statements, I'm a nerd, I look at financial statements of everybody. But the canal increased the amount of revenue that they had from about $500 million to $1.8 billion in the last 3 years, just because of those fees. So this is what is very concerning to us.
And so what can be done about that? Here's Daniel Maffei of the Federal Maritime Commission.
Panamanians are making far more on their canal than they ever had before. That's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's going to the right place. But where they're really making the money is on these auctions, and that is why remains a concern of mine, I'm sure the chairman's, and that is where we are looking at potentially are using our authority under Section 19 of the Merchant Marine Act, where we could, if we can show that it is basically a problem with the foreign trade of the U.S., it's interfering with foreign trade of the U.S., there are certain things that we can do.
And Section 19 of the Merchant Marine Act, which is often referred to as the Jones Act, that allows the Federal Maritime Commission to investigate foreign governments. And if they find that there are unfair conditions for U.S. shipping through or around that country, it empowers the U.S. government to put restrictions on foreign ships in U.S. ports. It allows us to put tariffs, Trump's favorite economic weapon, on foreign shipping services. And we can even suspend entire trade agreements. And we do have a trade agreement with Panama that's been in effect since 2012. But there is also an explanation for recent fee increases that are not due to the Panamanian government being a wee bit greedy. Here's Daniel Maffei of the Federal Maritime Commission.
Because the canal is essentially a waterway bridge over mountainous terrain above sea level, it does depend on large supplies of fresh water to maintain the full operations. Panama has among the world's largest annual rainfalls. Nonetheless, insufficient freshwater levels have occurred before in the canal's history, such as in the 1930s when the Madden Dam and Lake Alajuela were built to address water shortages. Since that time, the canal has undertaken several projects to accommodate larger, more modern ships. In the last couple of years, a trend of worsening droughts in the region once again has forced limits to the operations of the canal. Starting in June of 2023, the Panama Canal Authority employed draft restrictions and reduced the number of ships allowed to transit the canal per day. Now, the Panama Canal limitations, in combination with the de facto closure of the Suez Canal to container traffic, has had serious consequences for ocean commerce, increasing rates, fees, and transit times. Now, fortunately, Panama's 2024 rainy season has for now alleviated the most acute water supply issues at the canal, and normal transit volumes have been restored. That said, while the Panamanian government and Canal Authority have, with the advice of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, developed credible plans to mitigate future water shortages, they also warned that it is likely that at least one more period of reduced transits will occur before these plans can be fully implemented.
And so the fees remain an issue. But at worst, it seems to be an issue that we would fight with economic weapons as opposed to shoot you in the face kind of weapons. And there's reason to believe we might not have to fight Panama at all, because the witnesses had examples of recent Panamanian government cooperation with our government. Now, first, here's Senator Ted Cruz branding the Panamanian government as the baddies.
Panama has for years flagged dozens of vessels in the Iranian Ghost Fleet, which brought Iran tens of billions of dollars in oil profits to fund terror across the world.
But here's the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission slapping that down with facts.
About a year ago, when we were having this drought issue, there was also a lot of focus on Iran and how they were funding Hamas and the Houthis because they were attacking the Red Sea. What we found was, what the United States has found, is that Iranian vessels are sometimes flagged by Panama in order to avoid sanctions, so that they could sell the fuel that they have, and then they can take that money and then they can use it as they wish. Panama at the time had a very complicated process to deflag the vessels. There was an investigation, there was an appeals process. By the time that we would, OFAC or Treasury would go ahead and identify one of those vessels, by the time that they were doing the appeals and stuff like this, they've already changed flags to somewhere else. So when we went to Panama, we met with the Panamanian president. And I must say that we were very impressed because he was 30 minutes late, but he was breaking relations with Venezuela at the time because the election was the day before. We explained to him the situation. The very next day, we met with the maritime minister, with U.S. Embassy personnel, and Panama actually adjusted their appeals process so to make it more expedient. So if the United States or OFAC would come and say that this Iranian vessel is avoiding sanctions, now we have a process in place to go ahead and do that. And 53 vessels were deflagged because of that meeting.
So there's good reason to believe that this is one conflict that the Trump administration, while definitely making all of us aware of it, well, they didn't cause it. And they actually seem capable of solving it without setting the whole world on fire. Isn't it nice to have an example of a crazy Trump thing turning out to be a little less crazy once you dig into it a bit? And it's also a little less scary once you dig into it a bit. And this is why I love to watch Congress. Because once we get details, once we can understand what's going on, a lot of fear often just melts away. And so I hope next time you hear someone say that Trump intends to invade Panama, I hope you'll share this episode with them. Or at least the knowledge from this episode, and that way you can calm them down on at least this one point of hysteria. Because there's plenty else to be worried about. And so let's at least take a Panama Canal war, for now, off our minds. Because I feel safe in mentally moving on. And now I would like to thank Hank Barta, who is getting another executive producer credit. For those of you who are not in the know, executive producer credits, they cost $535 per credit, and every time you get one, you essentially put your vouch on an episode, and that moves that episode up our most valuable episodes list, which is on congressionaldish.com, and that is where I send all new people who want to know what episodes they should listen to first, because now we have a back catalog of 312 episodes. That's a lot. And so our producers get to choose what are the most valuable. And so Hank Barta considers Congressional Dish 292, Sabotaging Palestine, to be a very valuable episode. And with his executive producer request, he sent in a message. So he said, quote, "Please apply a producer credit to Congressional Dish 292, Sabotaging Palestine. I'm choosing that because I see mentions of USAID, which now seems to be on the chopping block. If Jen is aware of an episode that better explains what USAID does, feel free to substitute it or suggest if you prefer my approval. Secondarily, this is important considering the U.S. policy in Gaza at the moment," unquote. I haven't really done any deep dives on USAID, so this one is as good as any. But yeah, I do think that this is an important episode if you want to know what's going on in Gaza, especially now as President Trump seems to be at least saying he's on board with the idea of really letting Israel complete that land grab in Gaza. I don't know if you guys saw, I mean, most people saw it, I think, the very weird AI-generated Trump Riviera little video that he put out there where he has this vision of Gaza being rebuilt alongside Netanyahu, because in the video, he's sitting next to a pool in lounge chairs next to Netanyahu. So it's clear he's not building it with Palestinians. And in his new vision for Gaza, there's a giant gold statue of Trump, and Elon's there eating stuff more than once. Yeah, it was super, super weird, but the signs are pointing towards ethnic cleansing, which is not great. But then at the same time, since Trump has been inaugurated, we've had a ceasefire. So I don't know what the hell is going on there, but I do think being aware of the long-term history, because none of this started on October 7th. This has been going on for 75 years. The short way to really explain it is there's been a land grab going on. Right now, I mean, there's been a ceasefire in Gaza, but the land grab in the West Bank is ongoing. So while eyes have turned away from Israel and Gaza right now because of the ceasefire, they're bulldozing houses in the West Bank. And so more and more land is becoming Israel and less land is available for the state of Palestine, which, according to the documents that founded Israel, there were always supposed to be two countries. There was always supposed to be an Israel and there was supposed to be a Palestine, and only one of those right now exists. So yeah, thank you, Hank, for putting an executive producer credit on that episode. That now moves Sabotaging Palestine up to the 4th most valuable episode position. And so 1 through 4 are now War Money, which is also, that's really the history of Israel. I did that in the War Money episode. That was the hardest episode I've ever had to produce. It took me 2 months and lots of tears. That was a very emotional episode for me because I was not aware of Israel's history. And it was hard for me as someone who knows and loves a lot of Jewish people. I grew up in a Jewish community. I have a Jewish family. I want them to have Israel. I just also want Palestine to have a country as well. So yeah, that was a really tough episode, but I am really glad that my producers love it as much as they do, because it's now the most valuable episode of Congressional Dish. Then we have Contriving January 6th with 6 executive producers. In the number 2 spot, we have WTF is the Federal Reserve in the number 3 spot. And now Sabotaging Palestine is in number 4. And I can tell you that all episodes with 3 executive producers or more are on the front page. And so if you want to move any of those up, just put on a credit, and that really does move them into the top 5, because there's a bunch of episodes with 3 executive producers. All right, so that's it for today. If you want to hear what's going on a week-to-week basis, again, please sign up to support the show on Patreon. Right now, the way the payment structure is set up is we suggest $5 per episode, but I'm pretty sure you can still adjust that to whatever you want, and which means, yes, you can adjust that down if you want to. But the payment structure is whatever you pledge on Patreon, you pay for these public episodes. And in general, I do 2 public episodes per month. I think in the last 8 years, there's only been 1 month where I've ended up doing 3 episodes. So it's either 2 or 1 episodes. And you can also set a cap too. So if you don't want to pay for the 3rd, you don't have to. But yeah, if you support the show on Patreon, that's how you can get the Last Week in Congress episodes. And they have been a huge hit with the producers who are listening to that. So please support the show if you want access to those. And those are also more off the cuff, so you'll hear more of my opinions if that's what you're interested in, because believe it or not, I actually keep a lot to myself on these public episodes. All right, so I would like to thank Mike at Pro Podcast Solutions, who does our editing. I would like to thank Claire, who, even though she's on maternity leave, she did do the research for this episode, or at least a good chunk of it. I'd like to thank Mark at podcastbranding.co, who does our web design and security. I'd like to thank my sister Lauren, who does bookkeeping and the executive producer services. I'd like to thank my dear old dad for being our tax dude. And I would also like to thank our guardian angel, Brian Karras, who did the art for us for years and years and years before he left us way too soon. All right. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.